Good evening. Before we get started, I want to encourage everyone to see in the Con building our latest acquisition, the painting by George Stubbs that we installed today and announced today. It's a really spectacular painting, so I hope you all go to see it. Meanwhile, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, Pierre Terjanian, in conjunction with the exhibition Art and War in the Renaissance, the Battle of Pavia Tapestries. Pierre Terjanian is a leading expert on arms and armor, and he will address this aspect, the arms and armor aspect of the exhibition. The magnificent loans from the Capodimonte Museum in Naples demonstrate that both textiles and forged steel, so skillfully crafted during the Renaissance, were luxury arts second to none. We're thrilled to have the opportunity to display such rare masterpieces at the Kimball. In January of this year, Pierre left the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where he was the Arthur Ux Sulzberger Curator in charge of the Department of Arms and Armor, to take a new position as Chief of Curatorial Affairs and Conservation at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, where he leads a division of 16 departments, overseeing the MFA's vast collection of over 500,000 objects and its acquisitions, loans, and exhibitions. Pierre was educated in his native France in business law, management, and history. He holds degrees in private law from Paris II University, a Master of Science in Management from HEC Paris, and a degree in history from Metz University in France. He began his curatorial career at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where he was the J.J. Medvekis Associate Curator of Arms and Armor and acting head of the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts before 1700. His catalog, Princely Armor in the Age of Dürer, a Renaissance masterpiece in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, accompanied a major acquisition of horse armor for the museum. Also notable is his identification and scholarship focused on the Thun sketchbooks, a rare set of 16th century albums of drawings illustrating the works of leading German armorers. Known in the late 19th century, the Thun sketchbooks went missing around 1936. Pierre located the surviving albums in a museum in Prague. He analyzed and published this material in 2013 and 2016, providing invaluable insight into the accomplishments of master armorers. In 2012, Pierre joined the Met, where he was in charge of numerous initiatives, acquisitions, and programs. Among his important exhibitions, I'll mention the stunning, fascinating, and illuminating 2019-20 exhibition, The Last Night, The Art, Armor, and Ambition of Maximilian I. Maximilian, by the way, was the grandfather and predecessor as Holy Roman Emperor of Charles V, whose army prevailed at the Battle of Pavia. Earlier this year, Pierre was elected as Curator Emeritus in recognition of his service to the Met. In January, he also received the prestigious Marika Vilcek Prize in Art History. Awarded annually, the Vilcek Foundation prizes honor immigrants for extraordinary contributions in the arts and sciences. Pierre, we're all looking forward to your talk this evening.
Good evening. I want to thank the director, Eric Lee, the Kimball Museum, Art Museums, and all of the staff. It was a very warm welcome for the invitation to be here tonight. I'm going to be speaking to the armor that you see in the tapestries. I hope you have seen the exhibition. I had the pleasure of spending the afternoon in the rooms and looking at the wonderful works of armor, but also at the tapestries after the conservation, looking so stunning and so beautifully displayed. The purpose of this presentation is to provide an overview of the significance of armor in the Renaissance, in terms of how it was designed, how it was worn. Armor provided protection in various kinds of combat, at war, but also in the tournament. It was a source of prestige, owning it, wearing it, giving it, and it was also closely associated with power. So this is one of the tapestries from the series where you see the bridge being dismantled, and you will see armor in pretty much each of the panels, worn by soldiers on foot, but of course also worn by the nobility on horseback. I will start by just reminding ourselves that wearing armor, some protective gear, for the purpose of avoiding injury and death, is something that's neither European nor medieval. It starts with many cultures using fibers, natural materials, organic materials, as well as metal, of course. And certainly so here we have a funerary stele of a Roman soldier. You can see the helmet, the armor made of lamellae, sort of rectangular plates of metal, the gear for protecting the lower legs, and the shield and the sword. It is already in Roman times that mail armor was something that was often worn in combat. Mail armor consists of little links of either brass or iron that are interlocked with one another. A shirt like this consists of about 50,000 such links that form a mesh, very flexible, and it's assembled one by one from wire. They coil around a mandrel, and then connected by little rivets. And here is a depiction of the medieval armor of Nuremberg at work using pliers to close the links, one after the other. Mail armor was very important in the Middle Ages in Europe. It was probably the most popular form of protection. It was both breathable, it was flexible, it was easy to put on and to take off. You could turn mail into pretty much a protection for anything, for the head, the limbs, the torso. It was also not just worn by men, but by horses. And it was very easy to mend. If something got damaged, you just added a few more links where you could patch it up. But it was not enough. Against missile weapons like arrows, crossbow bolts, spears, swords, shield was always carried along with mail armor. And you have here the representation from a very famous illuminated manuscripts, which is in the Morgan Library and Museum in New York, showing how the shield can be worn on the back in siege warfare or on the front. And they sort of went together. I'm here, of course, talking about the effectiveness of this equipment, but it was not sufficient for the vital organs and certainly not so for the head. And therefore, from very early date onward, you already saw that Roman soldier. Here we're in the 13th century. There are a variety of headgears worn by knights on horseback as well as soldiers fighting on foot to protect their heads. Those helmets were sometimes made of leather, but more commonly made of iron. And in the case of the knights that we're seeing here, multiple plates secured together like panels by rivets, basically enclosing the entire head. The development of the crossbow, which was called by the Pope the devil's weapon, because it was so easy to learn, to use, because he could shoot from so far, and because it gave great force to the bolts, penetrating force, led to the development and adoption of more rigid defenses as a supplement to mail armor over the, in this case, looking at these funerary effigies, strips of metal on the shins, larger pieces around the knees, even the feet are protected. And then the arms reinforced here with strips of metal. And you cannot see it, but worn beneath this tunic is a piece of metal to which are attached chains, and to each chain would be connected the weapons, a dagger, a sword, a shield, and the helmet. So it's very gradually over the 14th century that mail armor is supplemented and conquered by these plates of metal, at first very crude, very basic, rectangular pieces, circular pieces, and then gradually more and more elaborate in shape, wrapping themselves around the entire body. still supplemented at times with other materials. And this representation of St. George here from the late 14th century shows a tunic probably made of leather. We know from documents of the period that it was not uncommon to have 36 layers of deer skin stitched together, worn over male armor, providing both a flexible, breathable, but also extremely stubborn material that would stop a lot of weapons at the time. But by the mid-15th century, more and more commonly, the armor is now from head to toe, entirely made of metal plates, heat treated, so as to turn what is a combination of iron and limited amount of carbon into steel. And as you can see from the close-up of this representation of two heroes, very good against sword cuts and other damages. There is actually a helmet in the exhibition that bears very similar damage. If you look closely, you will see the sword cuts into the metal. This is perhaps the idea that we have of the knight, cap à pied, or head to toe. And we have to remind ourselves that it all starts with iron ore. Here's an example excavated in Austria. The very type of iron ore that we used to make this armor for Charles V when he was a teenager. So the armorers are only some of the craftsmen that are involved in the process of converting iron ore into an extremely sophisticated, articulated set of armor elements that can cover one's entire body. They can also be stylish. But they're certainly master metal workers, and very much in high demand during the period of the Battle of Pavia. They're capable, I think of them also as sculptors, of tailoring the armor to the measure of a specific client. You can see how these legs almost look like they're wrapped like leggings onto a person. We know from inventories that armorers kept the measurements of their clients, and they even have plaster wooden models of their legs and other limbs, so it would always fit, and they could make from a remote place a replacement suit of armor for their clients. When we're thinking about Renaissance armor in Italy, by the middle of the 15th century, there is a certain type that comes into being, a type that is distinguished by the volumes, very ample armor, a certain construction, typically asymmetrical with more defenses on the left. The reason for that is a right-handed person tends to carry a weapon in the right hand, and when the horseman, the left hand is holding the reins of the horse. So the left side is very vulnerable. He needs more reinforcement, more protection than the weaponized arm and hand on the right side. So this painting of the Battle of San Romano gives you an idea of the weapons used at the time, the lance, which can be anywhere between 11 to 16 feet long, using a charging horse at full velocity, using the impact of the tip, which is of course fitted with a metal piece, piercing armor, unseating the opponent, causing damage. In close combat, hammers, maces, other weapons, including swords, are being used as well. And there is something very architectural about the end result. There are many options of how you can articulate those pieces around the body, and the Italians, by the mid-15th century, were basically the suppliers of all of Europe. Italian armor was the best, the finest, the most expensive, and those who could afford it, whether they lived in Norway or in Spain, would acquire Italian armor, and even had the means that would import Italian armorers who would then work under their protection in their homelands. A good sense of what these armors look like, perhaps a bit clearer here, is with the statue, Francesco Sforza. You can see what I'm describing as the reinforcing piece that is larger on the left side, a narrow one on the right, and something that's very close-fitting, tailored to the measure of the individual. No complete armors from the period survive. This is one that's now in Glasgow. No, the helmet has not survived, the gauntlets have not survived, but it gives you an idea of what the actual object looks like. And by the 15th century, the Germans start to become very serious rivals to the Italians. They also export their works to the rest of Europe. They have a completely different take on style. You see how angular this piece is. It's contemporary with the statue I just showed you. And fashion is always very important. You will notice the toes. This is in keeping with what men were at the time. Same for the very narrow waist and for the very long legs. This is the style and prevails in civilian fashion, and armorers, the greatest ones, are not creating just protective garments, but they're also creating something that shapes your image, that projects an image of confidence, of perfection, according to the canons of the time. This goes back to even the pleats, the folds, or the textiles being replicated in metal. Now, what I'm showing you is an armor that was made for Maximilian, who was just mentioned as being the grandfather of Charles V. And Maximilian had extraordinary means, and this is an extraordinary armor, probably one of the finest made in Germany at the time. The armorers would become very playful with their ability to work with metal. For tournaments, they created helmets that looked like masks. They could take the form of an animal, a rooster, who are known to be very feisty, or something that is more like a human form. And I'm showing you here an example of how such helmets would be worn with complete armor in the context of tournaments, which are friendly combats with an attendance watching the combat unfolding. There's no doubt that even though some of these armors could be used in combat, many of them were commissioned solely for show. You have to think of a bride's gown, only to be seen one day for a very important occasion. And the rulers of Europe would sometimes have an armor made just to be seen one time. This is the case with this armor that it mimics the skirts that men wore at the time. And here's an idea what the helmet looks like. Not impractical, but not designed for combat, more designed to be remembered, to be admired. So the armorers who were behind these works viewed themselves as artists, and they were handsomely paid. They were privileged among craftsmen, more than goldsmiths or painters, because when they carried out their work, they had to gain proximity to their clients. They had to measure them. They had to do test fittings. So you have to imagine that these armorers could get very close to people like Charles V, and some of them we know from payment records would come back 10 times for test fittings, and they would strike a conversation with the ruler. There are many noblemen who would not ever be able to get this close to having an audience with the emperor. In this exhibition, you have some of these armors that have been primarily designed for battle. And here's one from Capodimonte, which is of a later date, but designed for what we call the field, that is the battlefield. Such armors were practical. They typically weigh anywhere between 50 and 60 pounds, which is not much less than what our current soldiers wear in the field in terms of gear. It's flexible, it's articulated. You can get back up if you fall. You can get on a horse. You can run. But as the tapestries will show you, not very good for swimming. And they had their limitations. I'm back here with the Morgan Library manuscript showing that even edge weapons could damage well-made armor. We have to think of the relation of weaponry and armor as an arms race. Armorers were constantly catching up with the latest weapons. They could make armor that would not bend or would not be pierced. And when firearms were in use for a very long time, they were able to make armor that would withstand pretty much any handgun known to man. Handguns were already used in the 15th century in battle, including by horsemen. This is a very rare manuscript that shows you what a very crude early handgun would look like used in combat. And by the 17th century, armor was so effective at stopping bullets that the only way you could gain an advantage against the enemy was to shoot them point blank in the gaps. You see here somebody wielding a pistol, and literally that's the end of the barrel, trying to shoot in one of those gaps. Same here. So it's easy when you think of art and war to look at the tapestries as something that is beautiful, and it is. But of course, the objects I'm talking about when used in combat are part of warfare, and there's no questioning, as you see in these pictures, that they're meant for business. These armors that were capable of stopping bullets were typically tested by the clients before they purchased them. And many of them bear the dents of the trial before they were paid for. I think you can see here on these images what that would look like. These are all from the second half of the 16th century, so after the date of the tapestries, but already by the time of the tapestries, bulletproof armor existed. And you have in the exhibition this breastplate, so torso defense, the front part, that I looked at very carefully, and this is an exception. You see 3 indents in it, and this was actually one that was used in combat because the bullets are damaging the decoration. The armors would typically be tested first, decorated afterwards if they withstood the damage. This one, the decoration is beneath the bullet damages. So this is an example of a bulletproof breastplate that saw action in the early 17th century. But armor was not always used at war. It was also used in spectacles. Some of them look like this, almost a theatrical settings with very large audience, indoors. This is an actual event that took place in 1627 when men would fight in armor with very long spears across a fence. And then other contestants were waiting for their turns. This looks more like fencing than a wild form of armored combat, but it was actually very dangerous, and the armor is extremely heavy. They can weigh up to 100 pounds. They will only be worn for 20 minutes or so. And those encounters would be preceded and followed by pageantry. So here's a 17th century time painting showing the pages that precede the contestants. And you see the importance of the plumes that adorn the helmets and the textiles as part of this performance. Perhaps more familiar to us is the joust contest, also friendly, in which 2 knights face each other on horseback and very much imitate a warlike situation in which a lance fitted with a sharp tip would strike the opponents either on the shield, which are wearing here, or somewhere else. The highest score would be achieved by hitting the head. So these armor were highly protective and specialized for these types of tournaments. By the end of the 15th century, there are more than 20 or so kinds of friendly combat performed across Europe. So if you're well-traveled, you would have to have more than 20 different kinds of suits just to attend those performances. And during the Renaissance, manuals were compiled telling you what your shopping list should look like. Here are all the elements you need for one type of contest. Here are the ones you need for another, and so forth. Needless to say, this was very expensive. A typical jousting armor would be about a full year's wages for a highly skilled architect. The luxury armor could cost as much as a townhouse in Manhattan today, if you have to put in perspective. So clever armors developed what we call the garniture. One core armor for used in battle with exchange pieces decorated to match that can be combined and substituted to other pieces to adapt the original armor for here the Italian joust and here the German joust. So instead of buying multiple armors, you have one, but it comes with 50 to 100 additional pieces decorated to match. And those who could afford it, this is the brother of Charles V. This is one armory commissioned in 1547, and those are only some of the pieces that came with his garniture. It looks like multiple separate armors, but this is what the garniture looks like. This is for Rudolf II, another Habsburg. Even more pieces were required. The ownership of these pieces and the circumstances in which they would be seen by many was a projection of your wealth, of your access to the armorers who knew how to construct these very complicated garnitures. And needless to say, you would outgrow them and you had to replace them often because they were made exactly to your measurements at the time you needed them. So somebody like Rudolf would have not just these, but one set for every 10 years. And this is one wall in Madrid, in the royal palace, of only some of the garnitures of Charles V. There are others that are stayed in Vienna, and there are other walls showing just the same number of pieces. The armorers who designed these kept a record of the pieces that they made and their designs. This is an album showing what the armorers of Greenwich, working for the English crown, made, and some of them are already hand-colored to give a sense of what the finish would look like. But they would show these drawings to their prospective clients to confirm what they would actually make. And similarly, the patrons, somebody like Charles V, would keep a record of what had been purchased and commissioned and entrusted with his staff so that nothing would get lost and there would be a track record of what went together. So this is an album from about 1544, compiled for Charles when he was still in the Low Countries, but then ultimately taken to Spain. Every page shows a garniture with some of the pieces that come with it. And some garnitures are so extensive that it's like up to 6 pages to show all the pieces that go together. So I want to return our attention that I talked about armor for war, armor for the tournament, armor for show, to the tapestries. You have these scenes of combat, which very much look like what we associate with knightly combat and the joust. We have here 2 knights. This is not a friendly contest, charging at each other, and one is struck by the lance of the other. This is a good, faithful representation of how long these lances could be. If this man is anywhere between 5 and 6 feet, you have more than double that for the length of the lance. And during that period, most of the armors in use would have been made in Italy or in Germany. And of the type that is more or less illustrated in the tapestries, not even half a dozen such armors survive today. So this is one that was made for the King of Aragon. This is Ferdinand, who with Isabella launched imperial and colonial ventures in the Americas. These are 2 armors that belong to a Visconti, a Milanese family, noble family, that are now in the Musée de l'Armée in Paris, all from the same period, early 16th century. This was made for one man who was a Doge of Venice and is now in Vienna. And this one is one of a series of armors that were donated as votive gifts to a church in Mantova and kept there up to the beginning of the 20th century. And for that reason, they remain complete. And even Charles V, who, as you know, did not participate in the Battle of Pavia, he was actually in Spain while the battle unfolded. He did have armor too, and he did go to war in person on later occasions. For example, in Mühlberg, where he fought the Protestants in Germany. And this is one of his earliest surviving armors, which gives you again a sense of not only the finery, but the importance of decoration, both in relief and then etching and gilding techniques used to add gold and patterns to the surface. So in this set of tapestries, I see Bernard van Orley, who had a close observation, clearly studied original armors for his designs. The accuracy is extraordinary, and certainly so with the armor of Francis I or François Ier, shown here. What's also interesting is he's not just showing the knightly armor, he's showing the armors worn by light cavalry, more mobile units that could specialize in scouting locations, but also chasing the enemy, being lighter, they could move faster. And one thing that is also captured very neatly in the tapestries is the importance of textiles as an indispensable complement of any self-respecting knight armor. Here is one of the victors who is, as you can see, wearing a surcoat of textiles, very elaborate, that is covering the armor. Court tailors kept records of the surcoats they made for their clients. Armor was not always worn on its own. It was very important to combine it with these textiles. These are pretty simple. They're mostly meant for travel, but for each major trip, the Duke of Bavaria would ask them to make a new one. And then some were quite fancy, as you can see here, for a representation of the King of France, Louis XII, leaving Alexandria for Genoa, having a matching surcoat for his armor and a caparison, that is a covering for his horse. Here's another representation of him here wearing one that is made of cloth of gold. one of the most extraordinarily expensive and luxurious textiles available at the time. François Ier is shown here in a different battle than the Battle of Pavia, but always wearing on his armor those surcoats. And the representation in the tapestries on view here at the Kimball Art Museum is so minute and careful. So for example, you can see that the texture that this looks like, this is silk. You see the crown F of François Ier in the borders. And perhaps not so clear here is on his torso is a cross, which is the emblem of the French, adorned with rubies and with mother of pearls. And we know from inventories and payment records that kings went to battle wearing diamonds, pearls, rubies, the most expensive gems. And why would they do that? Because it was inspiring for the troops to know they had the resources, the material wealth to conduct war, always an expensive proposition. And if any of their people were captured, usually the kings were expected to defray them and pay at least a portion of their ransom. So you always went to battle in style in the Renaissance. Functionality was not the primary concern. This is we're back here to with the inventory of Charles V's possessions that shows how carefully his people kept a record of those textiles with the skirt, the surcoat, and the pieces for the horse, matching patterns. There are pages after page of these elaborate textiles that were considered part of the armory. So now, I would like to move to the larger significance of armor. It's very important in portraiture. A nobleman, typically, and for a very long time, sometimes up to the 18th century, would prefer being shown, portrayed, wearing suits of armor. Sometimes a direct reference to the careers. Federico da Montefeltro was one of the condottieri of Italy. He made his fortune, he was in charge of a relatively small state, by making money, by being a military leader for whoever could pay him. And he's shown here in prayer at the feet of the Virgin in full armor as a memento of his career. And this other portrait here with his only son, he's shown as a learned man reading but still wearing the armor beneath the clothing. It was so important to his identity. And by the mid-16th century, with Titian, but other artists as well, it becomes more and more fashionable for noblemen to be portrayed full length, wearing armor, or at least pieces of armor, with the remaining pieces around them. Virtually every ruler, up to the early 17th century, would follow this formula. Bust portraits remain popular. This one is in the Hispanic Society of New York, is the famous Duke of Alba, who was one of the great Spanish commanders for the Habsburgs, responsible for the sack of Antwerp in the 16th century. And the specificity is clear that these armors are not copy and paste. They're part of the portraits. The portraits are not just portraits of people, they're portraits of their armors as well. So here's a test. If you think about the prestige that the armor confers, it's expensive, it's something that is made to measure, you have many of them, they are a sign of rank, they can speak for your taste, they can also speak to your close association with power. So spoiler alert, one of these men is not a king. Which one is the king? There are not many clues in this painting. It turns out that on the right side you have the King of Spain, and on the left side you have his favorite and prime minister. It was common for the noblemen, especially those who had responsibilities in government, at the time to follow the taste of their leader. They would try to acquire the armors from the very same sources as the king. They would make their image after the image of the king. And so you see these kinds of competition in portraiture, but also in ownership. It is true that the Duke of Lerma, on the left, owned armors that were virtually identical to those that the king had obtained. In portraiture, you sometimes have more cryptic references, whether it's just a prop, a helmet here, and it's not always clear that this was something that was in the artist's studio, whether this is something that actually the sitter owned. But in other cases, we actually know that these were specific pieces that the sitter insisted should be included in their portrait. Guidobaldo della Rovere, Duke of Urbino, is shown here in what is actually a pretty small painting on copper. And you will see a breastplate, very strange breastplate, peeking through on the right. This breastplate has survived. It's one of these fantastical armors made in Milan by the Negroli family for him, and it's now in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, Russia. And you see a helmet peeking on the left, and this helmet is also in the Hermitage and has survived. So very unusual armors would be created, and they would make their way into state portraits. Francis I was second to none in owning distinctive armor. We have portraits that speak for how elaborate they were. This one was covered with early manneristic patterns, very much based on sort of Italian models. This armor has not survived, but this one, worn by one of his sons, who would later rule as King Henry II, has survived, is now in the private collection, and the helmet is in the Louvre. As if this were not enough, it was also common for armor to incorporate the emblems, the coat of arms, the devices that identify the owner of the armor. So here you have a hydra that is at the center of the shield, and a motto or a pun or a text that is specific to the owner. This is part of a set. There's a whole armor that survived, and every element of it is decorated with a hydra, which was one part of the coat of arms of Sforza Pallavicino, whose shield and armor this belonged to. And we have here in the exhibition very similar use of these emblems with a backplate, where you can see here the inclusion of a design that is not superimposed on an existing armor. The armor was commissioned with this band stopping neatly to make room for it, and it was integral to the design of the armor when this was made. So the antiquity, the comparison during the Renaissance is a rediscovery of ancient times, Roman culture, and admiration for the greatness of Rome. And every Renaissance ruler is an aspiring Caesar. They use the imagery of being shown as such in prints, in paintings. Here is a Habsburg, similarly dressed like a Roman. And it's not clear whether some of these armors that are shown here, there's like a shield and a helmet worn by a page, actually existed. But we know that such armor was made. In the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you have here a parade helmet that is in the shape of a lion's head, and by wearing it, you would look like Hercules, wearing the mane of the Nemean lion that Hercules had defeated. He's always represented wearing the lion's hide on himself. And in a parade, in a procession, an early Renaissance ruler of the 15th century could present himself to the audiences as the new Hercules of the time. Armors in the Roman style, this one made by a goldsmith for, again, Guidobaldo della Rovere, were following very closely what was understood to be an ancient Roman design, purely for show, with very dramatic components like the shoulder piece here in the form of a mask. And Charles V himself embraced the repertoire, and here had a helmet made for him in Milan, very much leaving just an opening for the nose and the eyes, in which he would appear as a Roman Caesar to anyone seeing him in context of a festivity. In the exhibition here, you have one of those helmets that is very much following the inspiration of the antiquity. This helmet is from the 1570s, so later than the tapestries, and entirely inspired by ancient Roman design. Even the decoration here is showing the story of Marcus Curtius, who was a young Roman who witnessed a chasm in the Forum and a fissure in the ground. Rome was going to be engulfed in flames. He jumped into it with his horses, giving his life. The gap closed and he saved Rome. And he was considered an example of self-sacrificing noble inspiration for all Renaissance rulers. It's one of the most common types of representation you find on parade armor at the time. A helmet like this would typically be accompanied by a shield that would repeat the same story. Here, it does not survive. Armor provided such legitimacy that children also wore armor, and armor was made for them to inscribe themselves within a dynasty, within a continuity of power. They would be presented to others as the mirror image of their fathers or uncles. And you have here an early example around beginning of the 15th century of the Duke of Brabant presenting two of his sons wearing the same surcoat with the arms of Brabant, and both of them clad in armor. This is in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, and you have here what is probably the heir to a member of the family of the Rovere, heir of the state, who's holding an adult-sized helmet, too big for him, but with the oak leaves, which allude to the name of the family, showing his bright destiny. And more literally, in the late 16th century, boys would often, young princes, be shown fully equipped for war, wearing a breastplate, a gorget, the helmet and gauntlets on the side, a sword in one hand, a pistol in the other. And in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, there is one of the latest known examples made in the beginning of the 18th century for Prince Luis of Asturias, who was only 6 years old when this armor was made. And it was a diplomatic gift from the Bourbons of France to a Bourbon of Spain, trying to maintain the alliance between Spain and France, not traditionally friends, in the context of the same lineage of rulers that were now in both places. Armor makes its way into funerary monuments. It's one of the preferred ways that noblemen wanted to be remembered for eternity, for posterity. They have themselves represented in stone, wearing armor, and sometimes with very elaborate cast and enameled monuments. Here, these in the Escorial monastery, Charles V himself with his family in armor, and then his son, King Philip II of Spain, an illegitimate child, Don Carlos, shown together. It's also a gendering device. The men are wearing armor, women are wearing domestic clothing. Armor makes its way as artifacts also into churches. The Black Prince, one of the protagonists of the 100 Years' War that divided France and England, had his arms, his shield, his gauntlets, his sword, his helmet, and his surcoat hung in Canterbury Cathedral. These are replicas, but the originals have survived. The churches provide time capsules, and you can still see them if you visit Canterbury Cathedral there. These are from the 14th century. A helmet, very unusual for the tournament in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was hung over the tomb of Sir Giles Capel, who fought at the field of the Cloth of Gold, an encounter between Francis I and Henry VIII, and he prescribed in Last Will of Testament that his best tournament helmet should be hung above his tomb. It was so important to their identity that those objects which had been made for practical reason would then be turned into a symbol of their rank, of their achievements in a religious context. Before the French Revolution, if you went to Notre Dame, you could see Philippe le Bel, or Philippe the Fair, King of France, having a full equestrian statue of himself in there. This statue did not survive the French Revolution, but it was quite common for monarchs to show themselves in churches. And this was a sovereign ruler of a small state in the Netherlands called Gelders, who is still showing there with a mannequin and his armor in Arnhem in today's Netherlands. So where did all of these objects came from? Like how was it possible to have so much at one's disposal? What was exactly the role of armorers in the crafting of this image for sovereigns and rulers? We have some representations of the Renaissance showing them in rather humble workshops. Here are some armorers working at their benches, hammering large plates of metal. Sometimes they needed to be heated, but a lot of the work was done when the plates were cold. It was always teamwork. Typically, you had a master and then journeymen and apprentices helping with the hammering. This is a breastplate being shaped. And one of the most vivid representation of the work being done here is from this woodcut, which is part of an album that Maximilian I personally owned and revised and annotated, which is now in the Museum of Fine Art, Boston, showing Maximilian at a young age visiting his favorite armorers at work and giving them advice and looking at how work was progressing on his behalf. But the image of the armorers, as you see in film, living in the woods or in something that looks more like a hut than a house, is misleading because of their close connection to power, because of the incredible sums that their works commanded, because of the type of clients that they work for. The most successful armorers lived in something that was more palatial. This is a house that was demolished in Milan in 1903, which belonged to one of the most successful families of armorers of the 15th century in Milan, the Missaglia. Fortunately for us, watercolors, the drawings, and even watercolors were taken before the building was demolished. And I'm giving you a close-up here what the facade of this place would have looked like. It had coat of arms of their most prestigious clients. It had all kinds of embellishments, including landscape painting, but it also has their personal mark, MY for Missaglia, surrounded by the crown, actually their brand, which they stamped on all of their work, so it was a form of an advertisement. This is one of the walls of what was a courtyard, multiple story, and this is where the armor was made, but it's also a place that was dignified enough for counts, barons, dukes, and possibly monarchs to come and visit and do a test fitting or place an order. They were in fact so famous that medals were often made with their effigies. There are very few medals of architects, painters, goldsmiths, sculptors, but there's a remarkable number of medals made during the Renaissance of armorers that would be distributed to their friends, to their clients, that function as a form of advertising. Some of them are commemorative, and they're made at the time of the death of these armorers. Kohlmann Hemschmied here on the left was one of the most successful armorers of Augsburg in Germany, and Pfaffenhauser, Anton Pfaffenhauser, was his successor, unrelated, but the next most famous armor in Europe at the time. These armors were so valued by the monarchs that many of them were ennobled. That is, they could retire from business and adopt a new lifestyle as noblemen. They would be given lands, they would be granted coats of arms, and this is a diploma for one of them. And suitably, the imagery of the coat of arms reproduces the helmets that the armor was so good at making. The works by these famous armorers survive. This is one of 12 armors that a wife commissioned as a gift to her husband for Christmas in 1591. All 12 armors have survived. They all look the same. It was one for her husband, the other one for his friends, so that he could partake in friendly combat. No one had to commission their own armors. They could just show up and they would fit. They came in multiple sizes. This was a very expensive proposition. She must have saved quite a bit to acquire this lavish gift. But this is an armor that is signed by Pfaffenhauser, one of quite a few that survive. And then his counterpart in Italy was Pompeo della Chiesa, an Italian armorer who was court armorer to Philip II of Spain, but based in Milan. And this is one of the armors for the foot combat that he made for an unknown Italian nobleman whose initials are combined here under the crown, adorning various parts of the armor. And this armor is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, but you do not need to go to Philadelphia because you have multiple of his works here from the Farnese Armory on view in the exhibition, including this very spectacular armor, a garniture. The breastplate here is for use on foot. It's an infantry helmet, but it has the matching design of the pieces for horseback. There were originally, presumably, 50 to 100 pieces, in addition to what we see here, that could have been exchanged to build up this armor. And as is often the case, The decoration includes here emblems that identify the owner, including the fleur-de-lis, which the Farnese, especially Alessandro Farnese, used. We owe the survival of these armors to accidents, to deeply conservative attitudes where for centuries no one did a house cleanup. But sometimes we also had very active measures taken to ensure that those objects that were so important would be actively preserved. And in the 16th century, when armor was still used for battle and for tournament, one Archduke, one member of the House of Habsburg, Ferdinand II of Tyrol, embarked on a journey. He would collect all the greatest historical heroes of the Renaissance. The villains, the adversary of the House of Habsburgs, including the Turks, including the French and others, as well as the greatest generals who had fought on the Habsburg side and the greatest members of the House of Habsburg. He created a museum that would commemorate their accomplishments. In his chateau or castle at Ambras in Tyrol, you can still visit it, perfectly in good order. His collections were housed there. He was originally based in Prague, but he retired to Tyrol, and this is where he built this castle around the needs of his collection. He commissioned catalogs of the armors that he collected. He would write other rulers, the descendants of generals, and say, can you send me, please, the armor of your grandfather? It's going to be in good company. It will be fully illustrated. It's one of the earliest examples of museum catalogs in Western history, created for the need to document in a biographical terms the lives of the people, but also what their armors look like mounted on mannequins. And each figure got full treatment, shown alive in a niche with captions and an explanation. And the original cabinets, wooden cabinets, pine cabinets commissioned, which would have had curtains at the time, in which these armors were displayed, still survive. And you can see one of the earliest museums in Western history with the original display furniture in Ambras, motivated by the significance of armor. This is the last image I wanted to show. I think through this lecture, we've sort of moved away from the practicality, the functionality of armor to its larger significance. But as you look at the tapestries, as you look at the armors in the exhibition, I think you can see this extraordinary tension between fantasy, the urge to preserve the memory of events and people and their appearance, and yet something that originally was developed fully for practical purposes. And I'm using this drawing as an example, I think a great illustration of that tension, where this writer here is wearing a classic Quattrocento, mid-15th century Italian armor, practical, classic, and the horse is turned into a monster, perhaps a dragon, with a neck defense made of scales and a covering here in the front that looks more like wings, and then a chevron, which is the faceplate, very much looking like that of a dragon. We could say this is artistic license, this is fantasy, this is a project for science fiction. No, many such pieces have survived, and like the writers, the horses were often transformed by the talent and the imagination of the armorers and the needs of their patrons. So thank you for your patience, thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to take questions.